The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the hospital ward, casting a soft glow on the rows of neatly made beds. Each one held a story, a fragment of a life touched by the chaos of war, though, for now, the ward was quiet, almost serene. Among these beds moved a figure whose presence seemed almost ordinary at first glance, a nurse whose steps were measured, her hands gentle yet assured. She carried herself with a calm efficiency that came from years of tending to the sick and wounded, her uniform crisp, her demeanor composed. In the stillness, she appeared simply part of the backdrop, a steady constant in a world already beginning to tremble on the edge of upheaval. Her days began early, before the sun had fully risen, with a meticulous ritual of preparing the ward. She checked the charts, ensured the patients were fed and medicated on schedule, and attended to the small, intimate needs that no one else noticed. A dropped pillow, a bandage that needed adjustment, a frightened glance that required nothing more than her reassuring presence. These were the quiet responsibilities that defined her work. Her hands moved with practiced ease, performing each task without haste yet without hesitation, the kind of movements that spoke of both skill and care. It was in these moments, among the ordinary routines of daily life, that she found a quiet satisfaction, a sense of purpose that, though simple, was unshakable. Yet, even in these tranquil hours, there was a hint of restlessness in her eyes, a flicker of awareness that the world beyond the hospital walls was shifting. She had heard the distant rumble of artillery, seen the black columns of smoke rising on the horizon, and read the brief, urgent telegrams that sometimes arrived at the nurses' station. Though she did not dwell on them, the news whispered of a larger stage upon which life and death were playing out, one in which she, by all appearances, was merely an observer. Still, there was a sense, almost instinctual, that her life was on the brink of change, that the compassion and discipline she wielded here would soon serve purposes far beyond the quiet corridors she now walked. The patients, some resting, others stirring, depended on her with unspoken trust. Their gratitude was subtle but palpable, a soft squeeze of the hand, a nod of acknowledgment, the faintest smile shared in passing. She responded in kind, her interactions gentle yet firm, each gesture measured to maintain calm and dignity. In these small moments, the nurse cultivated a world of stability, of humanity preserved amid the chaos threatening to encroach. Yet beneath the routine and the order lay an undercurrent of tension, the subtle promise that her skills, courage, and empathy were destined to be tested in ways no hospital training could anticipate. As the morning progressed, she moved from bed to bed, a quiet sentinel in a fragile world, the routine of her life a delicate balance between care and vigilance. Unseen by anyone, a certain resolve had begun to take shape within her, an unspoken readiness for the extraordinary, for the mission that would soon demand more than her hands and heart alone. Though today the ward seemed a haven of normalcy, tomorrow might call her to a stage she had never imagined, where courage, discretion, and quick thinking would no longer be optional but essential. And even as she completed her rounds, tending to each patient with the same gentle precision, a faint sense of destiny hovered at the edges of her consciousness, waiting for the moment when ordinary life would give way to the extraordinary. Outside the hospital walls, the world was changing in ways that could not be ignored. The distant hum of engines and the occasional sharp crack of artillery were no longer rare interruptions, but steady reminders of the conflict expanding ever closer. Towns she had once passed through with ease now bore the marks of occupation. Shuttered windows, patrolling soldiers, and the lingering unease that settled over streets where laughter and chatter had once flourished. Civilians moved cautiously, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation, navigating curfews and ration lines with a stoicism born of necessity. Posters and propaganda adorned walls, each demanding allegiance, each shaping perception, each a subtle pressure upon ordinary lives. In this world, even those committed to healing, the nurses, the doctors, the medics, found themselves at the crossroads of duty and survival. Within the hospital, the nurse felt these tremors of conflict in the air. Her days of quiet routine were increasingly punctuated by the influx of casualties from the front lines, young men whose bodies bore not only the injuries of war but also the invisible weight of fear, fatigue, and disorientation. The nurses, often overlooked in broader accounts of the war, became essential cogs in a vast, unyielding machine. They cleaned wounds, administered medication, and soothed minds frayed by trauma, their work rendered simultaneously indispensable and invisible. The nurse moved among her patients with a calmness that belied the storm gathering beyond the hospital gates, her hands steady, her focus unwavering, yet she could not help but feel the tension coiling in the air. Every convoy of ambulances arriving from distant battlefields carried a reminder that the war was no longer distant. It was a living, breathing entity, reaching into every corridor, every home, every life. And yet, the ordinary rhythms of hospital life continued in a fragile equilibrium. There were moments of respite, when she could linger over a patient's fevered hand or exchange a quiet word with a colleague, grounding herself in the semblance of normalcy that had become increasingly precious. Even these small interactions carried weight. A comforting presence could calm a man trembling from shell shock. A whispered reassurance could steady a young soldier's frayed nerves before surgery. It was in these understated acts that the nurse found purpose, her role extending far beyond the application of medicine to the subtler art of maintaining human dignity amid relentless chaos. All around her, however, the unseen machinery of war churned with a complexity that few fully grasped. Intelligence officers moved discreetly through towns, carrying coded messages, observing, cataloguing, and sometimes recruiting those whose skills could serve purposes far removed from the battlefield. Rumors circulated among the staff of civilians detained for questioning, of whispers in cafés intercepted, and of packages mysteriously arriving for delivery under strict supervision. Though the nurse's days were dominated by tending to wounds and monitoring vital signs, the faint murmur of these covert operations reached her, threading through the hospital like an undercurrent she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. It was as though the hospital itself, a sanctuary of healing, existed in parallel with a shadowy world where secrecy was currency, and lives hung in the balance not only through bullets and bombs but through information and strategy. In the evenings, as she walked the quiet corridors, the nurse occasionally paused to watch the horizon beyond the hospital walls. Smoke from distant fires rose lazily into the sky, and the occasional clatter of boots on cobblestones reminded her that even here, behind the sanctuary of antiseptic walls and curtained beds, the war was present, insistent and uncompromising. The ordinary and extraordinary intertwined, a patient's hand needing support one moment, a coded message slipping silently through town the next. The nurse, though unaware of the full scope, felt the weight of this duality pressing gently against her consciousness. Every routine task carried a hidden tension, every step in the ward shadowed by the broader turmoil beyond, and though her world remained rooted in care and compassion, the edges of it were fraying, pulling her toward a reality where skill alone might not suffice. It was in this delicate balance, between tending to human fragility and sensing the invisible currents of espionage and strategy, that the nurse's life teetered on the cusp of transformation. The ordinary became extraordinary in ways neither she nor her patients could yet imagine, and the shadows of war, stretching ever closer, hinted that the path ahead would demand more than empathy and discipline alone. Unseen eyes were watching, and unspoken forces were maneuvering, while the nurse, anchored in her duty, unknowingly positioned herself at the threshold of events that would draw her from the quiet certainty of healing into the perilous, shadowed world beyond. The hospital corridors had grown quieter that afternoon, the clatter of morning activity replaced by a measured stillness. The nurse moved with her usual precision, checking charts, adjusting bandages, and murmuring soft reassurances to patients who shifted restlessly under the weight of their injuries. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she sensed an unfamiliar tension, a subtle dissonance in the rhythm of her day. It began with a figure in the corner of her vision, a man standing just beyond the threshold of the ward, watching without overt intrusion. His posture was casual, yet there was a precision in the way he surveyed the room, the sort of attentiveness that marked someone trained to notice details most overlooked. Their eyes met briefly as she passed, and a small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. It was neither friendly nor threatening, but it carried a weight that unsettled her. She returned to her duties, attempting to dismiss the encounter, Yet she found herself glancing back repeatedly, curiosity and unease warring for dominance. The man moved through the hospital with an ease that suggested familiarity, yet he carried no badge, no overt sign of official capacity. There was an elegance to his movements, a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the chaos she had grown accustomed to in her daily rounds. The next day, he approached her in the corridor while she was checking the supply cart, his manner casual, almost incidental, as though their meeting was a chance encounter rather than the deliberate act it clearly was. "You have a careful eye," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. There was no preamble, no explanation, only the observation itself, a comment so simple that it could have been a polite acknowledgment, yet it carried the unmistakable undertone of evaluation. She froze for a fraction of a second, her hands gripping the cart, uncertain whether to respond with politeness or suspicion. Her instincts, honed through years of vigilance over patients' conditions and small details, whispered that there was more beneath the surface. She sensed in him an understanding of precision and discretion, a recognition of skills she had long considered ordinary. It was unsettling to realize that someone so measured, so deliberate, could be watching, waiting, gauging the subtle qualities of her work, the steadiness of her hands, the calmness in her eyes, the quiet decisiveness with which she navigated the demands of the ward. Every motion she made, once purely practical, now seemed scrutinized, as though her life had been momentarily lifted from the routine and placed under an invisible lens. Despite the tension, a part of her could not suppress a flicker of intrigue. Why would anyone notice a nurse with no official authority beyond her ward, no connections beyond her colleagues, no role beyond tending to the wounded? The question lodged itself in her mind, persistent and insistent, coloring her thoughts even as she returned to rounds. Patients, the charts, the routine, all continued as before, yet the sense of normalcy had been punctured, replaced by a subtle uncertainty. The ordinary world of her hospital, once predictable and contained, now contained an edge of suspense. By the time her shift ended, the image of the man lingered at the periphery of her consciousness. She could not shake the feeling that this brief encounter had quietly altered the trajectory of her day, and perhaps her life. A ripple had passed through the fabric of her existence, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. The ward remained the same, patients still rested in their beds, yet she sensed that something was coming, something beyond the antiseptic calm of healing and care. The man had vanished as quietly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of his scrutiny and the unnerving realization that her ordinary skills were suddenly seen as extraordinary by someone who mattered in ways she did not yet understand. The man's next visit was neither casual nor fleeting. He appeared in her ward during a lull in activity, just as she was finishing the routine checks on her patients. There was no preamble this time. He looked at her with the same measured gaze, the same quiet intensity that had unsettled her days before, and he spoke with deliberate clarity. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice low, calm, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. The words hung in the air, at once simple and impossible. A proposition, directed at her, an ordinary nurse, whose life until now had been measured in temperatures taken, bandages applied, and faint smiles shared with patients too weak to return them fully. She stiffened instinctively, her mind racing to reconcile the familiar rhythm of her ward with the sudden intrusion of this unknown, extraordinary element. "A proposition," she echoed, her voice betraying a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped closer, lowering his voice further, as though aware of the fragility of the walls and the ever-watchful eyes of staff and patients alike. "The war is fought not only on the front lines," he began, "but in places unseen. Information moves quietly, invisibly, and sometimes those who seem ordinary are best suited for the extraordinary tasks required." He outlined the mission with care, each word weighted with precision. She would gather intelligence from occupied areas, relay coded messages through seemingly innocuous channels, and operate under a cover that would blend seamlessly with her daily routines. The assignments would require travel to areas thought off-limits, brief encounters with contacts who could vanish without a trace, and the constant awareness that discovery could lead to immediate capture. Torture, imprisonment, even execution were not abstract risks. They were very real possibilities for anyone caught in these clandestine operations. The man spoke not to frighten, but to impress upon her the gravity of the work, the stakes that went far beyond any hospital shift, any bandage, any patient's whispered gratitude. Her first reaction was disbelief. She had never imagined herself beyond the narrow boundaries of the ward. How could someone so ordinary, so anchored in the rhythm of tending to the sick, suddenly be seen as capable of carrying secrets, moving unseen, navigating dangers she had only glimpsed in the newspapers or through conversations filtered with fear and propaganda? The notion of stepping into such a world filled her with both awe and terror. Her hands, which had always been steady in the act of healing, felt suddenly inadequate against the invisible perils of espionage. Yet, alongside the fear, a spark of resolve flickered. She remembered the wounded soldiers whose eyes carried the weight of distant battlefields, the civilians whose lives had been reshaped by occupation, and the sense of helplessness she sometimes felt watching news of atrocities reach her ears, only to be powerless to intervene. Here was a way, however fraught with danger, to act, to move beyond tending symptoms of war into addressing its core, invisible currents. The internal struggle tore at her. Loyalty to her patients, the familiar faces that depended on her daily care, competed against the call of a broader duty, one that might save countless others if she succeeded. The man did not minimize the challenges. He spoke of the constant need for vigilance, of the mental strain of maintaining a double life, of the moral compromises she might have to make, of the loneliness and isolation inherent in operating in shadows. Yet he also conveyed a careful confidence in her abilities, in the discipline and empathy that had marked her life in the hospital. To him, her ordinary life had demonstrated qualities essential for the mission: attention to detail, calmness under pressure, discretion, and the ability to navigate human emotion with subtlety. Qualities invisible in the annals of war, but vital in the hidden war of intelligence. By the time he departed, leaving her alone amid the quiet of her ward, the nurse felt the full weight of the proposition pressing upon her. Patients slept unaware of the decision dangling at the edge of her consciousness, the ordinary rhythm of her duties persisting despite the extraordinary possibility now lodged firmly in her mind. The contrast between her small, controlled world and the perilous path just outlined was stark, almost dizzying. And yet, as she watched the sunlight filter through the curtains onto the pale sheets and the faces of those who depended on her, she realized that the choice before her, though fraught with unimaginable danger, was perhaps the first step toward a life that could mean more than tending wounds in a world that needed healing on every level. The days that followed the proposition were a whirlwind of preparation, a sharp departure from the orderly rhythm of hospital life. The nurse found herself removed from the familiar scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of the ward, and placed instead in a small, nondescript training facility hidden in the outskirts of town. The environment was austere: bare walls, simple wooden tables, and the low murmur of operatives moving with focused purpose. Here, every movement, every gesture, and every thought was measured against a standard far removed from the routines of caring for patients. Yet, it was within this unassuming space that her ordinary skills, the precision of her hands, the steadiness of her mind, the attentiveness honed over years of tending to the injured, would be transformed into tools of a different kind. Her training was rigorous, designed to stretch both mind and body to their limits. Mornings were devoted to physical conditioning, long runs that tested endurance, obstacle courses that demanded agility, and exercises to sharpen reflexes that had previously only mattered in the context of lifting, bandaging, or steadying a patient. The afternoons, however, delved into more elusive skills: code-breaking exercises, learning to read subtle patterns in intercepted communications, and mastering the art of disguise. She discovered, with both fascination and trepidation, the precision required to alter one's appearance, mannerisms, and even voice to blend seamlessly into different environments. Every lesson was accompanied by an emphasis on discipline and discretion. A single misstep could be fatal in the field, and every trainee was reminded of the stakes with quiet gravity. Emotionally, the transformation was no less intense. Fear was a constant companion. Fear of failure, of exposure, of being unable to navigate the hidden currents of espionage. Yet, beneath that fear, a stubborn curiosity began to emerge, a desire to test her limits in ways she had never imagined. Doubts surfaced daily, whispering that she was ill-prepared, that a nurse could never step into the shadowy world of intelligence without losing herself entirely. Yet the repeated successes, small victories in exercises and simulations, began to carve a new confidence, a recognition that her mind and body were more adaptable than she had previously believed. Guiding her through this transformation was a mentor, a seasoned operative whose presence was at once reassuring and exacting. He noticed the subtle qualities that others might have overlooked, the calm precision of her hands, the careful observation of human behavior, and the quiet persistence that had defined her nursing. With patient, deliberate instruction, he pushed her to refine these traits, molding them into strengths suited for clandestine operations. Occasionally, he challenged her with scenarios designed to provoke fear, moral uncertainty, or ethical dilemmas, forcing her to confront not only practical challenges but the emotional resilience required to navigate them. Through his guidance, she began to understand that espionage was not simply about skill or courage. It was about judgment, creativity, and the ability to remain composed when the world seemed poised to unravel. Hints of her ingenuity became increasingly evident. During a simulated operation involving coded messages and timed exchanges, she devised a method to conceal information within a patient's routine medical notes, a solution that impressed even her mentor. In another exercise, she navigated an obstacle course not through brute strength but by observing patterns in the setup, exploiting subtle weaknesses that others had overlooked. These moments, fleeting yet significant, reinforced her emerging identity as someone who could adapt, innovate, and survive under pressure. By the time her training drew to a close, the nurse had changed in ways that were both visible and intangible. Physically stronger, mentally sharper, emotionally steadier, she was no longer the woman who had once moved quietly through the hospital corridors. Yet, beneath the transformation, the core of her character, her empathy, attention to detail, and quiet determination, remained, now fused with the skills, discipline, and courage of a trained operative. She had crossed the threshold from caregiver to clandestine agent, poised at the edge of missions that would test every ounce of her ingenuity and resilience. The night she departed for her first mission, the familiar rhythm of hospital life felt impossibly distant. The quiet halls, the faint antiseptic scent, and the steady pulse of patients' breathing were replaced by the palpable tension of moving through a world alive with danger. Cloaked in shadows and the muted hum of distant activity, she stepped into a narrow alley, where the faint light of lanterns cast long, flickering patterns across cobblestones slick with recent rain. Each footfall echoed sharply, betraying her presence in a way that heightened her awareness with every step. Though she had trained rigorously, the reality of the mission, the knowledge that a single mistake could result in capture, torture, or death, settled heavily on her shoulders. Her task was deceptively simple in theory: deliver coded messages to a contact in a nearby town, observe the movements of enemy patrols, and relay intelligence on troop positions. Yet the streets themselves seemed to conspire against her, twisting and turning with a kind of irregularity that made her compass training essential. She paused at every corner, noting patterns in soldiers' movements, the subtle shifts in shadows, and the occasional glow of a lantern signaling the presence of a checkpoint. The adrenaline coursing through her veins sharpened her senses, transforming fear into acute awareness. Each decision, when to move, where to pause, whom to watch, felt both urgent and fragile, a delicate dance between visibility and invisibility. Her first misstep came almost immediately. In a narrow passage, she misjudged the timing of a patrol sweep, catching the sharp attention of a guard who barked a question in a language she only partially understood. Her heart pounded, but she relied on improvisation, offering a plausible explanation as a displaced civilian looking for shelter. She produced forged papers with trembling hands, her fingers slick with sweat, praying the careful preparation she had undertaken in training would suffice. The guard scrutinized the documents for an interminable moment, his gaze flicking to her face, measuring truth against deception. Then, with a grunt and a dismissive wave, he returned to his patrol, leaving her gasping in silent relief, her pulse gradually slowing but her nerves taut as bowstrings. The town itself was a labyrinth of narrow alleys, shuttered windows, and whispered rumors. Every interaction carried weight. A word spoken too loudly, a glance misinterpreted, could unravel weeks of preparation. She found her contact in the dimly lit back room of a cafe, a man whose presence carried the same quiet authority as her mentor, and whose eyes assessed her with the unspoken question of trust. The exchange of messages was swift, nearly silent, and required her full attention to avoid leaving any trace. She felt the weight of her responsibilities acutely, not merely in the success of the mission, but in the lives tethered to the information she carried, and the moral calculus of whom she could rely upon in this uncertain environment. At several points along her route, she encountered civilians whose plight tugged at her conscience. A young child, lost and frightened, clutched at her sleeve, prompting a momentary hesitation that could have cost her dearly. Yet she navigated these moral dilemmas with a balance forged in her years of nursing, compassion tempered by necessity, empathy constrained by the immediacy of survival. Each decision was a negotiation between the principles she had always held and the stark realities of war, a tightrope she had to cross repeatedly in mere moments. The return journey was equally fraught, the night deepening and visibility diminishing with every step. Enemy patrols moved unpredictably, and a sudden checkpoint forced her into a narrow alley where escape seemed impossible. Her mind raced, recalling every lesson from training: observation, patience, timing. Using the faint outline of crates and barrels, she adjusted her path, weaving silently through shadows and waiting for the briefest lull in movement to slip past. Her breath was shallow, her muscles tense, yet she moved with a precision that surprised even herself. When she finally emerged into the relative safety of the outskirts, the first light of dawn brushing the horizon, a sense of exhilaration and disbelief washed over her. The mission was complete, the messages delivered, and her survival unbroken. Every nerve, every skill, every ounce of courage honed in preparation had been tested and proven. For the first time, she recognized the extent of her transformation. The ordinary nurse who had walked quietly among patients was now a capable operative, able to navigate danger, improvise under pressure, and make decisions that balanced moral conscience with survival. As she returned to a temporary safe house, her body exhausted but her mind alight with awareness, she understood that the mission had not only validated her capabilities but also cemented her commitment to the path she had chosen. The shadows of the night still clung to her, a reminder that danger remained ever present, yet the success of this first venture into the unknown had forged a confidence that would carry her through the missions yet to come. The success of her first mission had been exhilarating, a surge of adrenaline and accomplishment that seemed to momentarily quiet the chaos surrounding her. Yet in the world she now inhabited, triumph was rarely permanent, and the shadows of war had a way of creeping into even the most secure corners. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, with whispers among operatives, notes left in ambiguous places, and the faint sense of eyes watching where none should have been. The nurse felt it first as a prickle along her neck, an unease that refused to dissipate despite her careful routines. Her instincts, once attuned to patients' needs, now served a different purpose: the detection of danger, the sensing of hidden motives in those around her. The betrayal came from an unexpected quarter. A fellow operative, someone she had come to trust during training and briefings, began behaving with subtle inconsistencies. Small errors in communication, evasive responses, and a reluctance to meet her gaze. At first, she dismissed it as fatigue or stress, but the quiet anomalies accumulated until doubt could no longer be ignored. A coded message was intercepted, revealing that intelligence she had helped transmit was being compromised. The realization hit with a cold clarity. One of her own had been feeding information to the enemy. The shock was profound, not merely for the immediate danger it created, but for the knowledge that in this hidden war, trust was a fragile, expendable commodity. Sleepless nights followed, each hour stretching endlessly as she replayed encounters and conversations in her mind, searching for signs she had missed. Her body, conditioned through rigorous training, felt the toll of vigilance, muscles tense even in moments of stillness, nerves perpetually wound tight. She found herself walking the safe house in the early hours, replaying steps, retracing routes, cataloguing every detail of her interactions, aware that even the smallest lapse could have dire consequences. The psychological weight was unlike anything she had encountered as a nurse. Here, healing was no longer the measure of success, and failure could not be undone with bandages or medicine. Each decision carried permanent ramifications, and each shadow was a potential threat. In response, she began mastering the delicate art of deception. Small lies, carefully calibrated gestures, and calculated omissions became tools of survival. She learned to project confidence while masking doubt, to offer information selectively, and to gauge the intentions of others with precision. Her mentor emphasized the necessity of this duality. To survive in shadows, one must become both watcher and phantom, he reminded her during a particularly tense exercise. The nurse absorbed these lessons with a mixture of apprehension and determination, realizing that deception was not merely a tactic but a form of armor, essential to protect both herself and the fragile threads of intelligence she now carried. Trust, she discovered, had to be earned anew with every encounter. Even seasoned operatives, once allies, could not be assumed reliable. She devised subtle methods to verify information, cross-check routes, and confirm identities without revealing her own intentions. Each interaction became a careful negotiation, a dance between revealing enough to maintain operational function and concealing enough to ensure survival. Her acute observation skills, once focused on symptoms and patient responses, now extended to body language, fleeting expressions, and the nuances of speech. She noticed the slight hesitation before a colleague answered, the too deliberate smile of someone hiding fear or intent, the subtle tremor in a hand that betrayed stress under duress. These details, previously invisible or inconsequential, became vital instruments in her expanding arsenal of espionage skills. The psychological strain intensified as missions grew more complex. Encounters with enemy informants, the constant risk of surveillance, and the unpredictable behavior of double agents forced her to remain perpetually alert. Her mind, once capable of compartmentalizing the demands of nursing, now juggled multiple layers of reality: operational objectives, personal safety, and the ethical dimensions of decisions made in secrecy. Moral dilemmas became frequent companions. Whom to trust, when to lie, what sacrifices were permissible for the greater goal. Each choice chipped away at the simplicity of her former life, reinforcing the reality that she was no longer merely a caregiver, but a participant in a shadow war where human lives, both allies and innocents, hung in the balance. Even within the sanctuary of the safe house, moments of respite were fleeting. Every noise outside the window prompted a pause, every unexpected knock or footstep a jolt of adrenaline. She learned to sleep lightly, to rest in increments, and to maintain a constant mental map of her environment. The physical discipline she had cultivated during training became a lifeline. Precise movements, controlled breathing, and keen observation all intertwined to keep her alert and capable. Her ingenuity, first glimpsed in training exercises, proved invaluable in devising safe routes, concealing documents, and improvising when plans faltered. Each success, however minor, reinforced her confidence, proving that ordinary skill fused with vigilance could survive even in extraordinary danger. By the time the shadows had fully closed in on her world, she had transformed irrevocably. The quiet nurse who once moved calmly among beds and charts was now an operative capable of deception, strategic thought, and calculated risk. She understood the fragility of trust, the necessity of vigilance, and the moral complexity of survival. In the shadows, her ordinary life had dissolved, leaving in its place a new identity forged by fear, courage, and relentless adaptation. The war outside the hospital corridors had seeped into every fiber of her being, and she realized, with both clarity and dread, that there was no returning to what she had once been. Amid the tension of clandestine operations, fleeting moments of human connection became rare treasures, fragile as the dawn light slipping through a narrow window. The nurse, now fully immersed in the shadowed world of espionage, found herself unexpectedly drawn to one of her fellow operatives, a man whose calm confidence mirrored her own, yet whose presence carried a warmth she had long thought impossible amid the relentless pressure of danger. Their interactions were brief, often a shared glance across a crowded safe house, a whispered exchange during a covert meeting, or the subtle reassurance of a hand briefly brushing against hers. In these moments, the ordinary warmth of human contact, once abundant in her hospital life, resurfaced, grounding her amid the chaos and reminding her of what she fought to protect. Friendships, too, were forged under impossible circumstances. Comrades who shared the risk of discovery, the strain of sleepless nights, and the intricate dance of coded communications became confidants, each aware that trust was both fragile and essential. In whispered conversations behind closed doors, they shared fragments of their lives outside the war, stories of family, dreams deferred, and hopes that now seemed distant yet impossible to abandon entirely. These bonds, forged in the crucible of danger, were deeper and more immediate than any she had experienced before, tied to survival, loyalty, and the unspoken understanding that each could be the other's shield, or the other's last witness. Yet even these connections carried the weight of inevitable sacrifice. The nurse learned quickly that attachments could be vulnerabilities, exposed in ways that enemies would exploit without hesitation. She watched friends disappear under the guise of missions gone wrong, their absence leaving silent echoes of grief and caution. The man she had quietly admired was once caught in a patrol sweep, disappearing into the night with only the faintest trail for her to follow, and the realization of his loss struck her with a cold, hollow pain. These moments of personal grief collided with her professional responsibilities, demanding that she suppress emotion long enough to continue the work that saved countless lives and preserved vital intelligence. Within this tension, a delicate balance emerged, the capacity to love, to care, and to grieve, alongside the necessity of discipline and secrecy. Each fleeting smile, every brief touch or shared laugh, became precious, heightened by the awareness that tomorrow could erase them completely. She began to understand that the human heart, though resilient, was constantly tested by war, and that the emotional stakes were as high as the physical ones she faced in the field. Her feelings became intertwined with her sense of duty, each act of affection shadowed by the potential for loss, each bond strengthened by the shared understanding that survival was never guaranteed. By the time another mission called her away into the darkened streets and winding alleys, the nurse carried within her a quiet ache, a testament to both connection and absence. Love and loss, fleeting and profound, had sharpened her sense of empathy while hardening her resolve. She had learned that the extraordinary demands of espionage required not just skill and courage, but the strength to navigate the human heart under the most impossible conditions. The world of shadows, danger, and deception remained ever present, yet these intimate moments, brief and fragile as they were, infused her with a determination that even the darkest nights could not extinguish. The intelligence had come with urgency that left no room for hesitation. The nurse, now fully immersed in her role as operative, was briefed in a dimly lit safe house, the room alive with the quiet hum of anticipation and restrained panic. Enemy plans, intercepted through painstaking efforts of multiple operatives, suggested that a critical supply depot was set to transport munitions that could turn the balance of an imminent offensive. The operation was unprecedented in risk: infiltration behind enemy lines, identification of the depot, the precise timing of sabotage, and the extraction of both herself and critical intelligence. The stakes were staggering. Success could alter the course of the war in that sector. Failure would almost certainly mean capture, torture, or death. The journey to the target began under the cover of night, the streets unfamiliar and fraught with the ever-present threat of patrols. Each step she took was deliberate, her senses heightened by the training that had become second nature. Shadows and lanterns created a world of shifting shapes, requiring constant calculation. At one checkpoint, her forged papers were scrutinized longer than she dared, the guard's gaze sharp, questioning, almost predatory. Her fingers, steady from years of nursing and refined through espionage training, produced the correct documents without hesitation. She met his inspection with an unflinching gaze, masking both fear and resolve, until a slight nod allowed her to pass. The pulse of the mission quickened with every step, each second a delicate balance between vigilance and action. Upon reaching the depot, she surveyed the perimeter, cataloguing every detail: the guards' rotations, the stacks of crates, the patrol dogs, the electrified fences. Improvisation became vital. When a sudden patrol deviated from the expected path, she adjusted her route, crawling along narrow shadows and slipping through the faintly illuminated gaps between buildings. Her hands worked swiftly to plant charges and manipulate locks, each movement precise and informed by both ingenuity and the instincts honed during years of careful observation. A misstep here would not merely cost time, it could end her life. As the first charge was set, the night erupted into chaos. A sentry spotted a flicker of movement, and shouts pierced the darkness. Heart racing, she ducked behind a stack of crates, her mind calculating the fastest exit while ensuring that critical documents were secure. The explosion that followed, simultaneous with her final manipulation of the lock, sent shock waves that rattled both the depot and her sense of composure. She stumbled but recovered, every muscle taut with adrenaline. She was acutely aware of the near impossibility of the extraction, of the enemies converging, and of the fine line separating success from catastrophe. The retreat through enemy territory became a desperate dance with survival. She navigated narrow alleys, scaled low walls, and crossed open courtyards under the faint light of the moon. At one point, a patrol cornered her against a crumbling wall, weapons drawn, eyes sharp with suspicion. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended. Instinct and training converged. She feigned a stumble, appearing vulnerable, then exploited the brief hesitation to pivot and sprint toward an unguarded side passage. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, yet the clarity of purpose propelled her forward. Each moment tested the full spectrum of her courage, ingenuity, and resilience. Throughout the ordeal, moral dilemmas punctuated every decision. She passed civilians unaware of the battle around them, calculating the risks of using their homes for cover or avoiding them to prevent harm. Every choice weighed the consequences for others against the mission's imperative. The intelligence she carried, and the lives dependent upon its success, added an invisible weight to every movement. For the first time, the nurse who had once measured the temperature of patients' foreheads now measured the pulse of history, balancing human compassion with the cold calculus of wartime necessity. The culmination of the mission arrived as she reached a narrow canal, the extraction point arranged with meticulous timing. Enemy searchlights cut through the mist above, and a small boat waited, nearly invisible in the shrouded water. Her hands secured the documents, her body trembling from exhaustion yet driven by unwavering resolve. Just as she leapt into the boat, a bullet grazed the railing, splashing water nearby, and a shout carried across the dark expanse. Heart hammering, she rowed with a desperation that belied fatigue, navigating through the fog and debris of a world now fully alive with danger. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, she had emerged from the night with mission and intelligence intact. The supply depot had been successfully sabotaged, critical plans disrupted, and her extraction executed with precision despite near disasters at every turn. For the first time, she fully understood the magnitude of her transformation, The ordinary nurse who once moved quietly among wards and patients had become a decisive, courageous agent, capable of improvisation under extreme pressure, ethical discernment in the face of peril, and steadfast execution of strategy where failure carried lethal consequences. The exhilaration of success was tempered by the sobering knowledge that the war was far from over. Yet in this mission she had witnessed the tangible impact of her actions. She had survived bullets, patrols, and moral uncertainty. She had outmaneuvered danger using intellect, skill, and instinct, and she had emerged not simply as a participant but as a pivotal force in the unfolding events of the conflict. In the quiet aftermath, as the boat carried her toward safety, she allowed herself a rare, fleeting acknowledgment of pride. The nurse of the past had been transformed, irrevocably, into a wartime hero, her courage and ingenuity now inseparable from the identity she had forged in shadows, danger, and decisive action. The war, though still raging beyond the horizon, felt at once closer and impossibly distant as she returned from the field. The mission she had undertaken, the sabotage, the intelligence gathering, the high-stakes encounters that had defined her transformation, left indelible marks on her mind and body. Yet recognition, if it came at all, would be muted. The nature of espionage demanded secrecy, ensuring that her contributions, however pivotal, remained hidden in official records and whispered anecdotes. The accolades she received were private, often in the form of a nod from her mentor, a carefully worded letter acknowledging her success, or the quiet gratitude of those whose lives she had directly influenced. Public recognition was forbidden, the truth of her actions buried in classified reports that only a select few would ever glimpse. This duality, of profound impact paired with enforced silence, became a persistent companion. She moved among colleagues and civilians with the same calm composure she had once carried through hospital corridors, yet beneath the surface, the weight of experience pressed heavily. Memories of near-death encounters, of split-second decisions that had determined life or death, surfaced unbidden during quiet moments. She found herself startled by unexpected noises, haunted by the shadows of those who had not survived, and sometimes awoken in the night by the echo of a patrol's footsteps or the flash of searchlights slicing through darkness. The trauma was subtle but persistent, a silent witness to the extraordinary risks she had undertaken. Relationships, too, bore the imprint of her secret of life. Bonds formed with fellow operatives were intense but transient, dictated by mission parameters and the ever-present threat of betrayal or loss. Friendships and romances, though real and deeply felt, were often curtailed by necessity, leaving fragments of connection and ache in their place. She carried grief for comrades who had perished, guilt for the moments when her choices, however necessary, had placed others in harm's way, and a quiet pride for the lives she had saved. Even those she loved most, family, distant and unaware of her true role, experienced a subtle distance, an emotional gap widened by her inability to reveal the full extent of her experiences. Amid this personal reckoning, she sought to situate her actions within the broader scope of the war. The intelligence she had gathered, the missions she had executed, had played a part in larger operations that shaped the course of campaigns. Enemy supply lines had been disrupted, offensives delayed, and critical information reached Allied forces in time to influence strategy. Though she could not claim direct credit, the cumulative effect of countless operatives, including herself, had tipped scales that historians would later document in broad strokes, the hidden contributions obscured yet undeniably present in the eventual outcomes. Her own reflection became a careful negotiation between pride and humility, courage and trauma. She recognized that the ordinary nurse who had once measured fevers and soothed the wounded had become someone capable of altering events far beyond the hospital walls. Yet the cost of that transformation was etched in both body and psyche. The quiet tremor when danger loomed, the relentless awareness of how close survival could hinge on instinct, the knowledge that some actions, necessary as they were, would leave permanent emotional scars. In the years that followed, as Europe began to rebuild from the devastation, she carried both the burden and the quiet triumph of her secret contributions. Her story remained largely hidden, its significance encoded in classified files and the fading memories of those who had fought alongside her. Yet in the private spaces of her life, in moments of reflection beside a window where sunlight danced across calm streets, she understood the depth of her sacrifice, the transformation she had undergone, and the indelible mark left by courage, ingenuity, and resilience. She had moved through war as a healer, a spy, and ultimately as a quiet force whose actions, though unsung, helped shape the tides of history. Years had passed since the missions that had defined her transformation, yet the echoes of those nights and alleys remained embedded in her consciousness. The woman who once moved quietly among hospital beds, measuring temperatures and offering small reassurances, had been irrevocably changed by courage, duty, and the unforgiving demands of war. She reflected on the paths she had taken, the decisions that had carried lives in their balance, and the extraordinary resilience she had discovered within herself. The title of nurse now felt simultaneously familiar and insufficient. She had become something far more complex, a caretaker of lives in ordinary wards and a protector of nations in hidden shadows. In quiet moments, she considered the countless women whose contributions went unrecorded, whose sacrifices were never publicly acknowledged. Nurses, operatives, couriers, and spies had worked in silence, blending seamlessly into the fabric of society while shaping the outcomes of battles and campaigns. They had carried not only bandages and medicine, but messages, intelligence, and the moral weight of decisions that often exceeded the comprehension of those who stayed safely behind lines. Their courage was measured not in medals or headlines, but in lives preserved, operations completed, and histories quietly altered. The recognition they deserved was muted, yet no less vital. She understood, with intimate clarity, the hidden valor that women had contributed to the war effort, and she carried a profound respect for those whose ordinary lives had intersected with extraordinary circumstances. Her own legacy was a tapestry of small acts and monumental risks, woven together in a way that could not be fully articulated. The mission she had undertaken had required ingenuity, discipline, and empathy, forcing her to confront both the darkness of human nature and the capacity for resilience that defined her character. She thought of comrades lost, of friendships and fleeting romances cut short by necessity or circumstance, and of the moral compromises that had weighed heavily upon her conscience. Each memory, each emotion, was a reminder that heroism was often inseparable from sacrifice, and that courage was measured not solely by success, but by the willingness to confront fear, uncertainty, and personal risk for the sake of something greater. Yet, amidst the reflection, there was a quiet sense of peace. She recognized that, despite the shadows she had traversed and the dangers endured, she had emerged with an enduring commitment to life, compassion, and purpose. The lessons of war, discipline, observation, adaptability, and moral courage had become inseparable from her identity, guiding her actions long after the missions ended. She carried forward the memory of those she had served, both in hospitals and in hidden operations, and understood that her life's work extended beyond personal recognition, encompassing the countless unsung contributions of women who had shaped history in silence. As she gazed out over a peaceful horizon, far removed from the alleys and checkpoints that had defined her wartime nights, she allowed herself a final, quiet acknowledgement. She was no longer merely a nurse. She was a witness, a participant, a hidden force whose actions had altered the course of events, whose courage had been forged in darkness, and whose legacy was etched in the lives she had touched and the history she had quietly influenced. In the interplay of remembrance and resilience, she understood that her story, and the stories of countless women like her, would endure not in fame, but in the lasting testament of courage, duty, and unwavering humanity. Decades had passed since the nights when danger seemed to follow her in every shadowed alley, and the adrenaline of missions long completed had settled into a quiet rhythm of ordinary life. She had returned to the world outside espionage with a careful grace, blending into a society eager to rebuild, yet unaware of the extraordinary deeds that had unfolded in silence. Family and neighbors knew her as a devoted caregiver, a compassionate presence, someone whose hands had healed and whose heart had comforted. The full extent of her wartime service remained locked behind classified files, her acts of courage invisible to those around her. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, the memories of coded messages, narrow escapes, and lives altered weighed persistently, a quiet testament to the life she had led in shadows. Occasionally, fragments of recognition emerged, subtle acknowledgments from those who had served alongside her. Letters of commendation, discreet awards, and private nods from her former mentor reminded her that her contributions had mattered, even if the public would never know. She accepted these quietly, understanding that true valor did not always come with applause or headlines. The ordinary nurse who had stepped into extraordinary danger had become a symbol of resilience, a hidden force whose influence rippled through history in ways unmarked by monuments or ceremonies. It was only decades later that historians and researchers, piecing together declassified records and personal testimonies, began to uncover the full scope of her work. The world slowly learned of the missions she had undertaken, the intelligence she had safeguarded, and the ingenuity and courage that had defined her actions. Scholars marveled at the precision and bravery of operatives like her, women who had lived in secrecy, whose contributions had been critical yet intentionally obscured for the sake of national security. Exhibitions, publications, and retrospective accounts eventually placed her story alongside the broader narrative of the war, illustrating the indispensable role of women whose sacrifices had long been hidden from public view. In her later years, she reflected with a quiet pride and humility, understanding the extraordinary balance she had maintained, a life of ordinary compassion intertwined with acts of extraordinary courage. She knew that the essence of heroism lay not in recognition but in commitment, the willingness to act decisively, with ingenuity and resolve, in moments when failure could cost lives. Her journey illustrated a truth that history often overlooks. Ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can rise to remarkable heights, shaping outcomes far beyond what they, or anyone else, might have imagined. As she gazed upon the photographs, letters, and carefully archived accounts that finally told her story, she realized that bravery is often quiet, that the world is shaped by countless unseen hands, and that one person's courage can indeed make a profound difference. Her life, once defined by both healing and stealth, stood as a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring human capacity to rise to challenges that seem insurmountable. Though she had walked through the shadows for decades, history had finally begun to illuminate her path, ensuring that the sacrifices of those who act unseen are remembered, honored, and never forgotten.